First of all, I'm delighted to be here, and I have to say, since everybody always thinks I'm a sociologist because I actually try to put developmental psychology in a social context, and even though I take that as a compliment, it's always frustrating to me that developmental psychologists don't think using a social context. And so in some sense, I'm doing multiple things with my work, which is one thing to say you can't think about the person without looking at the context and the cultures and the political systems, et cetera, in which they're embedded. So we can talk about that, but since I'm speaking to a room full of sociologists, I had to start off with that. Today what I want to do is I'm going to read from sections of my book and then talk to you about what I see as the key messages from the book. I'll probably talk at you for about 45 minutes, and then 50 minutes maybe, and then we'll open it up and have a good conversation for about an hour, which I'm looking forward to. I should probably give you a little bit of context before I start. I am a developmental psychologist, which means I follow young people over many, many years. So my samples that I'm talking about today come from interviewing boys starting when they're about 12 or 13 until they're about 18 or 19, the same boys year after year after year. Hundreds and hundreds of boys at this point. Also study girls too, by the way. As my daughter said, you study girls too, right? I said, yeah. But today I'm focusing on the boys, of course. And the point is what I'm interested in is what happens during adolescence. What happens to, how do the stories shift as they go through adolescence? And so I focus on those years, and I'll talk about why that interested me, particularly that age period. Okay, so we're going to start. Also, I tend to speak very, very quickly. So if I'm speaking, if my speed is way too quick, just raise your hand like this, like slow it down, slow it down. Okay. It is the middle of June, and the New York City heat is on full blast, making it even hotter in the empty high school classroom where 15-year-old Justin and his interviewer Jose sit in the late afternoon. Justin is being interviewed for the second time for our school-based research project on boys' social and emotional development. There's neither an air conditioner nor a fan in the classroom, so Justin, in his baggy jeans and t-shirt, pulls out a notebook from his backpack and begins to fan himself as he listens to Jose begin the interview protocol. The first set of questions is about Justin's friends, and he responds by discussing his network of peers in school. Turning to the topic of close friendships, he says, and every time I give a quote, I work a lot with narrative, so I'm going to do a lot of quotes here. This is my book. Okay. So you'll see the quote up here every time I read a quote. Turning to the topic of close friendships, Justin says at 15 years old, "My best friend and I love each other. That's it. You have this thing that is deep, so deep it's within you, you can't explain it. It's just a thing that you know that that person is that person, and that is all that should be important in our friendship. I guess in life, sometimes two people can really, really understand each other, and really have a trust, respect, and love for each other. It just happens. It's human nature." Unquote. Listening to boys, particularly during early and middle adolescence, speak about their male friendships is like reading an old-fashioned romance novel, where the female protagonist is describing her passionate feelings for her man. At the edge of manhood, when pressures to conform to gender expectations intensify, boys speak about their male friends with abandon, referring to them as people whom they love. And as Justin says, this thing that is deep, so deep it's within you, you can't explain it. So I want you to pay attention to that what looks inconsistent, right, with the intensification of gender expectations in the midst of resistance to it. They tell their interviewers in great detail and with tremendous affect about their best friends with whom they share their deepest secrets and without whom they would quote-unquote feel lost. Set against a culture that perceives boys and men to be activity-oriented, emotionally illiterate, and interested only in independence, these stories seem shocking. The lone cowboy, the cultural icon of masculinity in the West, suggests that what boys want and need most are opportunities for competition and autonomy. Yet over 85% of the hundreds and hundreds of boys we've interviewed throughout adolescence for the past 20 years suggest that their closest friends, especially during early and middle adolescence, share the plot of Love Story more than the plot of The Lord of the Flies. Boys from different walks of life greatly valued their male friendships and saw them as critical components to their emotional well-being, not because their friends were worthy opponents in the competition for manhood, but because they were able to share their thoughts and feelings, their deepest secrets with these friends. Yet when one looks at the research on adolescent boys, discussions of close friendships are almost entirely absent. When male friendships are discussed, they are often relegated to the superficial category of buddies and described as quote-unquote loose collections of peers that offer very little sharing or emotional support. Male friends are framed as backslapping pals, more interested in playing, competing, and boasting about various types of conquests than in talking together or sharing the details of their lives. These relationships are in essence often defined by their simplicity rather than by their complexity, emotional nuance, and depth. And the number of times I had the experience when I would talk about my researches on friendships, on boys' friendships, and people would say, not really joking, they'd say, well, that's going to be a short book. Right, because the assumption is that there's not much to it. It's basically just playing sports. And so that was an incredibly common response to it. While these representations of boys are considered true for all boys, ethnic minority and poor and working class boys, particularly those who are black and Latino, are assumed to be even less likely than their white peers to have emotionally expressive friendships. Such boys are stereotyped to be hypermasculine and thus unlikely to have friendships that entail much vulnerability. So I'm not talking about, I'm looking specifically at the extent to which they're stereotyped to not have a sense of vulnerability in them, right? Because there's a sort of stereotype of a sort of gangster closeness, but that's not about vulnerability. The only boys of color or poor working class boys who are exempt from these stereotypes are Asian boys, yet these boys have to contend with an entirely different set of damaging stereotypes that feminize their bodies and their academic achievements. In an article in a men's magazine in 2004, being Asian was equated with being gay. And there was a huge uproar in the Asian community around that equation, obviously. But the whole notion that it was considered so okay to show that kind of homophobic behavior that they could put in a mainstream men's magazine. They submitted an apology, and it was a big thing in 2004. Asian males, like their non-Asian peers, are also stereotyped, however, as being unemotional and inexpressive. And while some people sort of attribute that to Asian culture, a lot of people also talk about it as part of a gender norm. So if Asian boys are considered, just as, if not more, emotionally literate as their black, Latino, and white peers. And my point here is obviously these stereotypes about boys cut across race and ethnicity in different ways, but essentially the stereotype is the same. Yet my research over the past 2 decades that I'm going to talk to you about today suggests an entirely different story. And I want to just say, before I get into the findings, I'm going to go through all 3 sets of findings, is that the work really comes from, I was a high school counselor in the late 80s and worked with a lot of kids in urban high schools. And one of the things that drew me to the topic of friendships was meeting with teenage boys. And they were mostly black and Latino boys. And they came into my office to chat about various things. And I thought at the time, when I was going to be a high school counselor, with boys and girls, that the topics I would hear from boys are being either complaining about girls, complaining about teachers, complaining about parents, etc. That's what I expected. I was consumed with stories of friendships, feeling betrayed, wanting friendships, wanting the intimacy, not sure how to deal with the betrayal without looking wussy. I mean, all those kinds of discussions, they wanted to talk about their friendships. And I was blown away by that, and that was in the late 80s. And I thought, there's a story here that's not being told in terms of what are on boys' minds and what they're thinking about. And these are the very same boys that oftentimes get stereotyped, right, as the only thing they're thinking about is where to get the next pair of Nikes. So the whole ways in which it really countered a set of stereotypes, racial stereotypes as well as gender stereotypes. So that's where began my passionate interest in sort of looking at boys' relationships with each other and trying to see what happens to them as they go through adolescence. Okay, so most of the boys, just as a side point, but a critical point too, are black and Latino, Asian, and white. We can talk about that, in terms of variation across boys. What I'm presenting today is sort of the homogeneity in the sample in terms of the patterns, but please do ask about variation if you're interested, because there's another story to tell there. But today I'm going to talk about what was similar across the boys. Okay. The first theme, obviously, is this theme of shared secrets, boys sharing secrets. Hector says at the age of 14, I've got 2 best friends, Willie and Brian. Like sometimes when me and Willie argue, me and Brian are real close. Then when me and Brian are not doing so good, me and Willie are real close. It's like circles of love. Sometimes we're all close. And I'm going to throw out a whole bunch of quotes. Jason says at the age of 15, my ideal best friend is a close friend who I could say anything to. Because sometimes you need to spill your heart out to somebody, and if there's nobody there, then you're going to keep it inside. Then you'll have anger. So you need to talk to somebody always, unquote. Secret sharing or talking intimately with best friends was how boys defined a best friend. Okay, so they defined it through this vulnerability and intimacy. And betrayal of this confidence, that's a critical concept here. The betrayal of this confidence was the primary cause for terminating a close friendship. So it was the betrayal that led to the termination of the friendship. Mark says in his freshman year, my ideal best friend could just tell me anything, and I could tell...
Didn't come up when you
sorry,
did.
Okay, sorry, thank you. Yeah, if I do that again, call me on it. Okay, my best friend could just tell me anything, and I could tell him anything. Like I always know everything about him. We always chill, like we don't hide secrets from each other. We tell each other our problems, unquote. When asked to explain why he feels close to his best friend, Richard says, if I'm having problems at home, they'll out-counsel me. I just trust them with anything, like deep secrets, anything. Eddie says, a sophomore, it's like a bond. We keep secrets. Like if there's something that's important to me, like I could tell him and he won't go and make fun of it. Like if my family is having problems or something. And the key thing is, right, you can read this for those who focus on language, that the whole notion of he wouldn't go and make fun of me. So the whole notion of the being able to be vulnerable with another boy was the key part of this intimacy in their friendship. While boys obviously spoke about loving to play basketball, video games with their friends, the emphasis, however, was always on talking together and sharing secrets when they talked about their best friends. Sharing secrets also was not only a dyadic exchange, but also took place in a group. Sean says in his freshman year, you know, on that Christmas day, my friends and I all slept in this little bed. It was little. We were like squeezing, and then we were like listening to this cheap radio. My friend got a cheap radio. We were turning it to a low volume and listening to songs at like 12:30 at night till like 3 in the morning. We were not all listening. We were not all listening to the songs. We were talking about secrets, and that's how I know my best friends. Boys indicated that intimacy or sharing of secrets in their friendships is also what they liked most about the friendship. Ken says, a sophomore, we always tell each other everything, and I'm like, about something happens and I save it for my best friend. In his junior year, he says, what I like most about my best friend is the connection. It's like, you know how you know somebody for so long you could talk about anything, and you won't even think, oh, what are they thinking? You just talk. MJ says, I love that quote, actually. MJ says what he likes most about his best friend is, yeah, because my best friend is like a second person you could speak to. It's like, see how the kids carry a little teddy bear or whatever, and when they cry, they hold it and stuff. So when like you get upset or something, you just walk over to your best friend and he'll loosen you up, whatever. He'll be like, yeah, it's all right, even though it's not. Now here, this is interesting to me because MJ is recognizing both the safety that a friendship provides, but also the way boys cover over and tell stories that they know are not true. Right? So the key thing for here is they'll be like, yeah, it's all right, even though it's not. Right? So the ways in which boys are directly telling you like it is. They're telling you exactly how they're experiencing something. The content of boys' secrets varied considerably, and the term secrets were oftentimes used interchangeably with problems. Problems were always secrets, but secrets weren't necessarily problems. Mike makes distinctions between secrets when talking about the friends whom he doesn't trust and the friends he does. I mean, I can like joke around with my friends who are not close, and like if I'm like having trouble in my classes, like if somebody knows the subject better than me, like I'll ask them, like, yeah, it's pretty much like that, not too deep though. I wouldn't tell them my too secretest things, not too secretive. Yeah, like about a girl or something. I mean, that's not the deepest, nothing deeper than that though. With my best friends, I will tell my deepest secrets. The content of regular or not too deep secrets typically range from crushes on girls or girl-related topics. Really, really big secrets or secretest things were almost always related to conflicts in the home, or on rare occasions coping with disabilities or drug abuse of a family member. Paul admits that it's good to have a best friend because, quote, sometimes like you don't want to tell your family members because it's probably about them, and you just tell your friend and they'll keep a secret and help you. The next theme was, this is for a psychologist, this is a critical theme, hopefully for sociologists too. Boys make the direct link between these relationships and their mental health. This is not my interpretation, this is not my correlational analysis. The boys literally make the connection that these are essential for my mental health. Boys not only had intimate friendships, but that they believed this intimacy was essential for their health and well-being. Stevens says, in his freshman year, you need friends to talk to somebody sometimes. You know, like you have nobody to talk to. You don't have a friend, it's hard. You got to keep things bottled up inside. You might just start crying or whatever. Like if a family member is beating on you or something and you can't tell a friend, you might just go out, just, you know, do drugs, sell drugs, whatever. Alan says, there's a whole other paper I want to write about the term whatever, which I think is worthy of investigating. when people say whatever, right? Because that's a movement away from vulnerability. Right? When you say whatever, it's a movement away from vulnerability, and it has consumed our culture among adults and adolescents, the term whatever. Okay. Pet peeve there. Alan says in his junior year that he needs, quote, someone to talk to. Like you have problems with something, you go talk to him. You know, if you keep it all to yourself, you go crazy. Try to take it out on someone else. Another boy concurs, saying that without friends, you would go crazy or mad. You'd be lonely all the time. You'd be depressed. You'd go wacko. Kai says bluntly at the age of 14, my friendships are important because you need a friend or else you'd be depressed. You won't be happy. You'd try to kill yourself because then you'd be all alone and no one to talk to. And the key thing, again, I want you to point out here is it's not, I need a friend so I have something to do something with. I need a friend because I need a partner to play basketball with. This is a friend I need a friend to talk to, or else I would go wacko. Right? So the whole notion of talking being critical to the prevention of wacko-ness. Okay. Lee says in his freshman year, in response to why friendships are important, if you don't have friends, no, you got no one to tell secrets to. The interviewer says, so what happens then? Lee says, then it's like you need to keep all the secrets to yourself. And the interviewer says, what do you think it'd be like if you didn't have someone? Lee says, then it's like I always think bad stuff in my brain because like no one's helping me and I just need to keep all the secrets to myself. So the boys in my studies know that their intimate secrets are critical for their mental health. They speak about these relationships with such passion that people often ask me after listening to the boys' interviews, how did you get boys to speak like that? And we once presented this talk to teenage girls, and that's all they were asking me, how do you get boys to talk like that? And this is the interesting thing, this is the most, I think this is the most radical finding we had. We didn't get them to speak like that. We simply asked them the question about their friendships, and this is what they told us. Right? We were an interested person asking them about something as fundamental as their friendships, and this is what they told us. Again and again, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boys. I have to emphasize how many times we've heard these similar stories. Okay. Yet something happens to boys as they enter late adolescence. As boys enter manhood, they do in fact begin to talk less. They start using the phrase no homo following any intimate statement about their friends, and they begin to say that they don't have time for their male friendships, even though they continue to express strong desires for having such friendships. And that's critical here, because a lot of times people respond to this work and say, well, they have less of an interest in male friendships as they get older because they just want to hang out with girls. That's absolutely not what my data suggests. That the desire is absolutely still there, but they don't have them as frequently as they did when they were younger. In response to a simple question regarding how their friendships have changed since they were freshmen in high school, 2 boys respond and reveal everything about friendships for boys during adolescence. Justin describes in his senior year how his friendships have changed since he was a freshman. I don't know. Maybe not. Oh, and this is Justin, the kid you heard of in the first quote I gave about human nature and the intimacy. This is Justin 4 years later. Asked how his friendships have changed since he was a freshman, he says, I don't know. Maybe not a lot. But I guess that best friends become close friends. So that's basically the only thing that's changed. It's like best friends become close friends become general friends, and general friends become acquaintances. So they're just, if there's a distance, whether, I don't know, natural or whatever, you can say that, but it just happens that way. And the thing that's striking about this quote is, do you see what Justin does? It's exactly what our culture does. We take what is clearly cultural and make it natural, right? So he took his intimacy as natural, and now he's taking the distance as natural. And that, right, and in terms of the critique I have, as Michael does as well, of the work on boys, is that they've naturalized things that are clearly not natural. Michael says, in response to the same question, how have your friendships changed since you were a freshman? Michael says, like my friendship with my best friend is fading, but I'm saying it's still there, but, so I mean it's still there because we still do stuff together, but only once in a while. It's sad, because he lives only 1 block away from me, and I get to do stuff with him less than I get to do stuff with people who are way further. I'm like, yo, it's like a DJ used his crossfader and started fading it slowly and slowly. And now I'm like halfway through the crossfade. Okay, that one's the award for the best quote ever, right? Just in terms of the whole sense of fading out, the whole experience of these friendships fading out. Matthew says, simply, we used to be close as far as always being around each other. Now it's like we're apart. Like as far as like if I need them, they'll still be there. If I need them, I'll be there. If they need me, I'll be there. But as far as like always being together, we're not as close as we were before. So late adolescence for the boys in my studies is a time of disconnection from the relationships that they hold so close to their hearts, rather than simply being a period of progress, which is typically how developmental psychologists frame adolescence. Adolescence for these boys is also a period of loss. As their bodies are almost fully grown and their minds are increasingly attuned to cultural messages about manhood and maturity, boys begin to distance themselves from the very relationships that they relied on previously so that they wouldn't go wacko. Okay, I want you to start, as I'm talking, link my work to Michael's new book. Because I'm serious, there's a link. This is the link. Right, so they're distancing themselves from the very relationships that actually keep them from going crazy. Right? This is exactly who they start to disconnect from. Boys know by late adolescence that their close male friendships and even their emotional acuity put them at risk of being labeled girly, immature, or gay. And obviously in a homophobic and misogynist culture, being called girly and gay is an insult. And immature is certainly an insult. Thus, rather than focusing on who they are, boys, they become obsessed with who they are not. They are not girls, little boys, nor in the case of straight boys are they gay. In response to a cultural context that links intimacy in male friendships with an age, little boy, a sex, female, and a sexuality, gay, these boys mature into men who are autonomous, emotionally stoic, and isolated. The ages of 16 to 19, however, are not only a period of disconnection for the boys in my study, it is also a period when the suicide rate for boys in the United States rises dramatically and becomes 5 times the rate of girls, when in early adolescence it is only 3 times the rate. So right when I begin to see that loss, I found in the national data, which I didn't expect, this dramatic shooting up of suicide rates among boys. Just as boys during early and middle adolescence predicted, not having friends to share their deepest secrets makes them go wacko. When Jason, a 9th grader who has a close male friend with whom he shares all his secrets, is asked if and why male friendships are important, he explains, quote, "You are not lonely, you need someone to turn to when things are bad." That's his freshman year interview. 3 years later, he says, and this is stunning to me, he says in response to the exact same question, okay, tell me about your friends. With the 9th grade, it's about you'd be lonely, you need someone to talk to. 3 years later, he says, well, he has nothing against gay people, he himself is not gay. Okay, so all of a sudden the question has turned into a question about sexuality when he didn't interpret it about as a question of sexuality 3 years before. He also tells his interviewer that he no longer has any close male friends, although he wouldn't mind having such friendships like the ones he had when he was younger, as he thinks they may make him feel less lonely and perhaps less disconnected from school. Other boys during late adolescence responded similarly. When boys didn't directly discuss this link between sexuality and friendships, they did indirectly with the phrase "no homo," a verbal tic that was repeated almost after every intimate phrase. We're close, no homo. We talk, no homo. And then kids would sort of make a whole bunch of obviously outrageous jokes. You know, we make out, no homo. But the point is that the whole idea is that you're constantly asserting your heterosexuality in any sort of discussion of intimacy, emotional intimacy. Questions about close male friendships not only became questions about sexuality during late adolescence. Yet the striking part of boys' narratives during late adolescence is that while boys repeated the late 20th century equation, and that is definitely late 20th century, of close friendships with sexuality, many of them remained explicit about the sadness they felt as a result of the loss of these friendships. So you see what's happening here? They're both accommodating to the sort of cultural expectations of the loss, right? But they're resisting it by still articulating the sadness over the loss. So their resistance is still evident in their text, and that's what we want to hold on to when we talk about what we want to do next. Okay, so let me give you a sense of the resistance in the language. Guillermo says in his junior year quote, "Do you have a closer best friend?" the interviewer says. "Not really, I think myself. The friend I had, I lost it. That was the only person that I could trust, and we talked about everything. When I was down, he used to help me feel better, the same I did to him. So I feel pretty lonely and sometimes depressed, because I don't have no one to go out with, no one to speak on the phone with, no one to tell secrets, or to help me solve my problems. Why don't you think you have someone? Because I think it'll never be the same, you know. I think that when you have a real friend and you lost it, I don't think you find another one like him. That's the point of view I have. I tried to look for a person, you know, but it's not that easy." So while Guillermo discusses the loss of his close male friends, he remains explicit about the sadness. Victor says, I'll give you one more quote and then we're going to move on. Victor says in his junior year that he doesn't have a best friend this year, but he would like one. "No, I don't say I would, because I feel that a friend is going to be there for you, and he'll support you and stuff like that. Whether they're good or bad times, you can share with him. You could share your feelings with him, your true feelings. That's why I don't think I have any real close friends. I mean, things can travel around in a school, and things would go around, and the story would change from person to person. Yeah, basically, I hate it. I hate it. Because, you know, I wouldn't mind talking to somebody my age, that I can relate to him on a different basis." Like Guillermo, Victor longs to find the type of intimate male friends he had earlier, but fears that betrayal prevent him from continuing to pursue this possibility. So the fear of betrayal you start to hear again and again and again. Now, interesting thing I have to say, which we don't have time to talk about today, but I want to make a clear thing. There were two types of boys generally by late adolescence. One was the kids who were clearly articulating the loss. But as everybody knows, because it fits a stereotype, the other type of boy, what do you imagine the other type of boy? Is the I don't care, whatever, doesn't matter boy, right? So you had a whole slew of boys that you'd ask the question, and they'd say, "No, I don't have any friends. I don't care. Do you want friends? No, I don't care. I don't care. I don't care." And if anyone's a parent in the room, they know that the repetition of "I don't care" means they care, right? So, you know, and a couple of the boys actually became visibly upset in the repetition of "I don't care. I don't care. I don't care. Why do you keep on asking that question? I don't care." You know, I mean, basically this sense of really, I don't want to talk about it. And that, in fact, is a much more depressing story, right, than the boys who are actually able to articulate their loneliness. Because you can hold on to their sense of awareness of what's going on, versus the I don't care boys, what I'm going to call the I don't care boys, are much more lost, right, in their own sense of, they've disconnected entirely from their own sense of emotional well-being in some sense. Boys enter their teenage years with a tremendous willingness and ability to engage in intimate male friendships, despite the cultural dictates that discourage such behavior. Guillermo and Victor in particular, you saw examples of it. Yet as they enter manhood, they begin to lose their way. Their emotionally sensitive and astute voices become fearful and wary. Words such as love, so pervasive in their interviews during early and middle adolescence, give way to expressions of sadness, anger, frustration, or simply of not caring any longer. Right? So the whole thing we heard of love and feeling lost without him, that language literally gets zipped out of the interview. I mean, it's incredible to look on a narrative level. It gets zipped out of the interview, and the only thing you hear is either anger, sadness, frustration, or simply no emotion. Right? I don't care. The intimacy in boys' friendships, as well as the loss of such intimacy, is evident not only in my studies, but in studies of boys and men over the past century. In 1904, it's my favorite study, Michael. 1904, a survey study was conducted of 2,500 youth in the state of Illinois. These are farm kids. 1904. The researchers conclude that intimate friendships, which was defined as sharing secrets in your friendship, was common among both boys and girls, but apparently particularly among boys, and was considered critical to their mental health. This is 1904. Okay? Harry Stack Sullivan, of course, for all you psychology-trained people, if there are any in here, found the same pattern in his clinical work with pre-adolescent boys in the middle part of the 20th century, and more recently other researchers have also noted the intimacy of boys' friendships. Studies of adult male friendships suggest furthermore that the loss that I'm talking about is also common among men. So Stuart Miller, in a study of hundreds of men, concludes that, quote unquote, most men secretly cherish the memories of the close male friendships they had when they were younger. And this is interesting because you see it in pop culture. So that in the movie Stand By Me, if anybody remembers that, that's a classic. Richard Dreyfuss, as the narrator, is actually narrating this loss. the loss of friendships, and he says at the end of the movie, it's stunning. I think you were the one that told me about it. I went back and watched it because Michael told me to watch it. That he narrates this loss of friendships as you get older as a boy. Okay, yet despite, now this is the question, this is the pressing thing we have to deal with. Despite over a century of findings underscoring the intimate nature of boys' friendships, we continue to frame boys as activity-oriented, emotionally literate, and continue to devalue and demean those very emotional qualities associated with being female and with not going wacko, according to the boys. We continue to see boys and men as gender stereotypes and as different from girls and women in their social emotional needs and desires, rather than as humans with the same social emotional needs and capacities as girls and women. The relevant questions aren't how to teach, and this is the key point. It's not how to teach social emotional skills to boys. The question is, right, how do we foster it? Right? We don't need to teach them. I mean, a lot of the education literature, for those who don't know, is all about we need to teach empathy. We need to teach, right, these social emotional skills. We don't need to teach it. They already have it. They already know these skills. It's how to foster it, how to nurture it, right, in different contexts. Okay, so, but why do boys begin to lose their friendships as they get older? And why are we not paying attention to what boys are telling us for over a century? But before I answer these questions, let me remind you why you should care about friendships. And I'm going to do a brief tangent, but not really. So why are friendships important? And this is linked to thinking about what we're doing with boys too. So the two topics are obviously intimately linked. Decades of research with children and adolescents in psychology and all sorts of fields underscores the importance of friendships for all sorts of outcomes: emotional and physical well-being, academic achievement, all sorts of kinds of outcomes. Adolescents without close friendships are at risk of depression, suicide, dropping out of school, early pregnancy, drug use, and gang membership. In our surveys of the US and in China, we do studies in China and India as well, we find that support from close friends is more predictive of psychological well-being and academic performance than support from parents. Among adult men and women, researchers have consistently found that those who have close friendships or strong social support networks are less prone to depression, less likely to get physical illnesses, and more likely to live longer lives. And there's a great study where they prick people's finger and they assess how long it takes to, basically, your finger takes to heal. Those who are in close relationships heal faster. Heal faster, right? Okay, so they've done that bazillion times in the health-based research, showing that your body, actually your immune system, your body recovers from all sorts of kinds of harm to it faster when you're surrounded by close connected relationships. In a 6-year study of 736 middle-aged men, attachment to a single person, almost always a spouse, did not lower the risk of heart attack and fatal coronary heart disease, whereas having a strong social support network did. Smoking was the only risk factor comparable to a lack of social support. Researchers also find that people with strong social support are less likely than others to get colds and other common illnesses, and as I said before, at less risk of death. In a study of 30 industrialized countries, I'll go slow here because I'm giving you a ton of information. In a study of 30 industrialized countries, epidemiologists conclude that the two most important factors determining the health and well-being of people living in these countries, these are all 30 industrialized countries, two factors are most predictive of health and well-being, and that's social status, basically whether you're rich or poor, and friendship quality, whether you have close friendships or not. Thus, those who lack friendships and those who have low social status are at greatest risk for health problems and death. And interestingly enough, as a side point, because I have time here, so I can tell you lots of side points. In countries with the most income inequality, you see the poorest quality of friendships on a national level when they do studies, with the highest income inequality. Now this is striking to me. It's not just poor quality friendships among the poor. It's poor quality friendships among the rich, too. So in countries with high income inequality, that was one of their major findings, you see this dramatic difference in terms of the quality of friendships. Okay, this is all coming from a book called The Spirit Level, if anybody's interested. These are epidemiologists that write about this, called The Spirit Level. In an examination of over 148 studies that examine the link between social relationships and the risk of death, researchers recently concluded that individuals with strong social relationships have a 92% greater likelihood of survival compared to those with weak social relationships. The risk of death for those with poor social relationships are comparable with well-established risk factors for death, such as smoking and excessive alcohol consumption, and exceed the influence of other risk factors such as physical inactivity and obesity. This point underscores the fact that friendships, this is my point, is not simply a feel-good issue, it's a life or death issue. Okay, underscoring the importance of friendships in particular, I have one experiment to describe to you quickly, and then we're going to talk about why boys lose their friendships. Social psychologists at the University of Virginia, did I tell you this? You know this one. Yeah. Social psychologists at the University of Virginia find that perceptions, now listen because it's a little complicated, perceptions of task difficulty are deeply shaped by the proximity of a friend. Okay? In an experimental design, the researchers asked college students to stand at the base of a hill while carrying a weighted backpack and to estimate the steepness of the hill. Okay? So just imagine that these subjects are standing at the base of a hill and they're having to estimate the steepness of the hill with a big backpack on their backpack, on their back. Some participants stood next to close friends whom they had known a long time. Some stood next to friends they had not known for long. Some stood next to strangers, and the rest stood alone during the exercise. The students who stood with their close friends gave significantly lower estimates of the steepness of the hill than those who stood alone next to strangers or to newly formed friends. Do you know what that means? Do you get what it means? It means that your perception of the world, of how difficult things are, is shaped by who is around you, physically. Your perception of how difficult a class assignment is shaped by who's sitting next to you. Right? You're actually, right, and I don't need to repeat it again, but that's a stunning thing. That's a stunning thing that they actually, and they've proven that a million times. Now get this, they've also proven the longer the close friends have known each other, the less steep the hill appeared to be. The longer they've known each other. Yeah.
Were the estimates of steepness made covertly, or did the close friend hear your estimate of how?
No, it's done with all different. You know, it's not the same person. So it's it's everybody individual, and then they don't do it in front of the friend.
I'm just wondering if you're ashamed to, you may be putting on an act for your close friend.
You mean that it's not steep?
Yeah, it's nothing. I can do that in no time at all.
Yeah, but then you think they would actually make it more steep, right? In terms of a macho thing. It's really steep. But they don't report it in front of the friend. But the point is that these kinds of subtle tweaks in it, in terms of who's standing next to you, affects how steep you see the hill. In other words, the world looks less difficult when standing next to a close friend. In sum, decades of research have revealed the critical nature of close friendships for our health and well-being, and thus obviously why the loss of such relationships should be of such great concern. Okay, so let's go back to boys. Why do boys lose their friendships during adolescence? The reasons for boys' losses during late adolescence can be divided into what I call thin and thick cultural explanations, and I'm drawing loosely from Clifford Geertz's notion of thin and thick. Thin cultural explanations repeat narratives that are familiar to many and only skim the surface. When boys are asked directly about the loss of trust in friendships, they repeat well-worn narratives about why friendships disappear. What do you imagine boys say when you ask them why their friendships disappear? Just, what do you think?
Girls.
Yeah. They say having girlfriends, busy work and school schedules, changes in schools and neighborhoods. Essentially, boys gave risk-free reasons for the loss of friendships and trust, right? There's nothing vulnerable or risky about giving those reasons. The boys invoke these excuses freely, but this is the contradiction. But not without expressing frustration, sadness, and anger at their losses, and a persistent wish among a large cohort of boys to regain what they had earlier in their development. Thick cultural explanations for the loss of trust in close friendships among boys focus clearly on the conventions of masculinity that emphasize autonomy and emotional stoicism, as well as homophobia and sexism that discourage such friendships among boys and men in the first place. And all you have to do is listen to the fact that, right, having friendships is considered girly and gay, right? Right, and that says it all. Because why is being girly and gay an insult? Right? So the whole ways in which homophobia and sexism works is that the worst insult you can be called, right, as a teenage boy is to be called gay or girly. And that reflects on how we think about gay people as well as girls. Okay. Thick cultural explanations also draw attention to the larger pattern of decline in social connectedness and empathy over the past 30 years or so. And now I'm going to show you a large cultural phenomenon. In 1985, according to a nationwide survey study, the modal number of close friendships that adults had was 3 in 1985. Okay, the average number, the modal number was 3. While in 2004, the modal number of friendships nationwide among adults was 0, with almost half the population now reporting that they discuss important matters with either no one or only one person. In a series of college students since 1980, researchers report that there's been and they do these studies every 5 years of about 15 to 20,000 college students across the country. Researchers report that there's been a 40% decline in empathy, or in the amount of time that college students spend, quote, thinking about other people's feelings, with the biggest drop occurring after the year, tell me the year. What would you guess is the year when the empathy totally drops? How much of the time they spend thinking about other people's feelings?
21.
What?
21.
In the year 2000.
Oh.
Right, in the year 2000. So, no, not the age,
Okay.
the year. So in the year 2000, and essentially what you see is, right, that's the beginning. It's not, we don't have Facebook yet, but we have the beginning of a lot of the internet. Right, yeah. Dozens of other studies have reported similar studies. According to the social sciences, we are becoming increasingly disconnected and less empathic. And I have to throw in another statistic someone just gave me. It is now more likely, and suicide is dramatically increasing across middle-aged people and adolescents. Men over 40, the suicide rate has increased 50% in the past 10 years. 50% in the past 10 years. It is now more likely in this culture to kill ourselves than to get hit by a car. Suicide rates are higher than the percentage of people who get hit by a car. So what this all this data is coming together. By the way, there's a mass. I could go on. There's a mass violence happens now. It used to happen 3 or 4 times a decade. It now happens every 2 weeks in this country. And the definition is 3 or more people shot in one setting. So according to the social sciences and the data, we are becoming increasingly disconnected. We as adults in American culture appear to be facing the same crisis of connection that boys experience as they enter manhood. And you know, there's no doubt that our crisis of connection as a larger culture is deeply shaping these boys. I mean, they're one and the same. And finally, thick cultural explanations of boys' losses during late adolescence examine an obvious culprit, and that is our constructions of maturity. Despite, and as a developmentalist, that's a core theme for me. Despite the decades of work on the importance of connectedness, and there's all sorts of work, Carol Gilligan, Robert Selman, the essential components of maturity continue to be independence, stoicism, self-sufficiency. Mohammed says in his junior year, quote, "But I don't know. Recently, I kind of changed something. Not that much, but, I feel like there's no need to. I could keep my feelings to myself, I'm mature enough." Interpreting a desire to share feelings as a sign of immaturity, Mohammed shuts down. He understands implicitly that there are consequences to becoming mature. Other boys view these consequences as well, as they explicitly link maturity and isolation, saying things like, "Now I'm a man, I need to take care of myself and not rely on others." One only needs to ask the question, as one boy did, of what would it mean for us to define manhood and maturity as the ability to have mutually supportive relationships, including friendships, to underscore how far we are from valuing our emotional and social skills and our relationships more generally. These thick cultural explanations for boys' losses during adolescence allow us to see beneath the surface, but they don't explain why we as a culture have ignored over a century of research that reveal the intimate nature of boys' friendships and their acute social and emotional capacities. So why have we ignored the data? And I'm going to throw out some reasons, and you can give me other reasons that you think. In a world where we only believe right now what lights up on an MRI scan, where thinking and feeling are separated and given a sex and a sexuality, feeling is female and thinking is male, where we use the same word for our 750 Facebook friends and our 1 or 2 genuine close friends, and where the acronym BFF now refers to everyone who is on our Facebook pages. It's not surprising that we aren't able to see that what boys have in their friendships may not be the same thing as what they want in these relationships. Or that while boys may report lower levels of intimacy in their friendships than girls, they may still have emotionally intimate male friendships. Or while our gender stereotypes may capture an element of boys' experiences, it does not capture the full picture. We have not paid attention to what boys are saying and doing in their male friendships because we do not believe that boys are, by nature, interested in these friendships. And this is, Michael's work is in here as well, clearly. Yet if you look back in time in this country and look at other cultures, this argument about boys' nature falls apart. According to social historians, emotionally intimate friendships among American men were highly valued and very public in the 19th century and earlier. Honeymoons in 19th century America among middle-class families, middle-class couples, involved bringing best friends along for the trip. And, what I want to emphasize there, of course, is the totally radically different notion of what it means to have a friend, to bring them along on your honeymoon. Anthropology, right? I mean, it really makes you, it should make you laugh because it's so radically different. Anthropologists furthermore find that intimate friendships are strongly valued elsewhere, and most people have their own stories if they've traveled, if they've lived outside of this country. In southern Ghana, same-sex friends go through a marriage ceremony similar to that performed for husbands and wives. In Cameroon, adults pressure their children to find a best friend, much in the same way that American parents pressure their adult children to find a romantic partner. In China, and this is, my father was in China for many years and so did I. In China, at least until the late 1990s and in other Eastern and Middle Eastern countries, heterosexual men held hands with their best friends and regularly relied on them for emotional support. And what's interesting is, you know, with the introduction of American culture into China, and we all think that it's the introduction of liberal values, what is actually introduced is homophobia. Because what's actually happened is they're a deeply homophobic culture in terms of homosexuality is prohibited in China, but that whole sense that emotional intimacy between men now becomes pathologized and made into this, as it is in this country. So that they become Americanized in their homophobia. The Lakotas, a Native American tribe, have a long tradition of emotionally intimate friendships, where the emphasis for Indian men was on a close emotional bond. My point is, it is only in our modern American culture and in other cultures like ours that boys and men desire for emotionally intimate friendships is dismissed as a female gay and youthful proclivity. The cultured natures of our beliefs about the nature of boys is underscored in Lisa Elliott's book, Pink Brain, Blue Brain. She should come and talk about it. She's a neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, and she disputes numerous claims about sex differences in emotion and cognition. Calling on years of research and her own work in the field of neuroplasticity, Elliott says, quote, "Infant brains are so malleable that small differences at birth become amplified over time, as parents, teachers, peers, and the culture at large unwittingly reinforce gender stereotypes. Girls are not naturally more empathic than boys. They are just allowed to express their feelings more." Unquote. Elliott draws attention to the ways in which we make our stereotypes about girls and boys into what is naturally, rather than what ought not to be culturally. So finally, what are the implications? If we take what boys tell us about their friendships seriously, if we take their words at face value, if we take into account what we have learned over the past century regarding boys and men's friendships, we must begin to re-examine our understanding of what it means to be male, but also what it means to be human. And that is, in fact, what a growing group of natural and social scientists are doing in what's called a new humanism emerging in the sciences that underscore our empathic, cooperative, and social nature. The previous emphasis on competition and aggression as defining attributes of humans is now widely challenged, with scientists calling for, quote, "a complete reassessment of our assumptions about human nature," to take into account this new and not so new research. The fact that we are social beings and truly care about what others think and feel is the reason why, according to Charles Darwin and many others, we have thrived as a species. We want to cooperate. We want to have close relationships, including friendships. Yet our conceptions of manhood and maturity more broadly rest on valuing emotional stoicism and autonomy exclusively. And the fact that I want you to notice, the fact that our definitions of manhood and maturity are similar reminds us that we live in a patriarchy, right? Maturity and being a man and being mature are almost one and the same thing. We tell our children, particularly as they reach late adolescence, that they must not only separate from their parents, but also from their peers and move toward independence. We tell them to think for themselves and not worry about what others think or feel. In other words, we foster ways of being that are not natural and do not bring about psychological or physical health for boys, girls, men, or women. When asked what it would like to be a girl, and what it would be like to be a girl, Andy at the age of 16 says, quote, "It might be nice to be a girl, because then you wouldn't have to be emotionless." Our culture, in other words, fosters the crisis of connection that boys face in late adolescence, and the crisis of connection that many of us appear to be facing in the early 21st century. Now, if we look outside of the United States, particularly in school settings, we begin to see something different. So countries such as Norway and Canada are changing the way they school children to address their own crisis of connection. And I want to think about how they oftentimes use different language, but in some ways they're also transforming how we think about manhood, how we think about maturity, even though they don't use that language. And I think it's important to show how there's a connection even if you use different language. After 3 teenage victims of bullying committed suicide in 1983, Norway began a campaign, nationwide campaign, to build children's social and emotional skills, and thus decrease incidents of bullying. So professionals of all kinds were trained to identify and respond to acts of bullying, while students at all grade levels participated in weekly class discussions about conflicts and friendships. So this is an interesting thing about the bullying interventions that's happening in schools across the country. What do you imagine is focused on the bullying intervention? What's it? Even if you don't know it, what's focused on in bullying interventions? What are kids learning in the book? They're learning discipline, but what are they learning? They're learning basically don't be a bystander, right? Don't let someone else get bullied, right? What else? What do you imagine they're learning? They're learning basically how to stick up for your friend, how to basically create situations so that there's not bullying, okay, and that you sort of are watching each other. What there oftentimes is not enough attention to is actually how do you build positive relationships, right? So it's all about preventing negative stuff. It's not about building positive, right, moving forward in a positive way. So Norway, in contrast, focused on actually helping kids to build quality friendships. So every week, imagine this, weekly classroom discussions about conflicts and friendships. Basically, kids talking in class, using class time, right, to talk about the conflicts in their friendships and how to resolve them and think about them and work them out. Right, so how to build better relationships. A quasi-experimental study was conducted on 2,500 children to determine the effects of this large-scale intervention in Norway, and it continues on to this day, 30 years later. The results indicate that the rates of bullying dropped by half and stealing and cheating declined over the 2-year period. Furthermore, significant improvements were detected in the social climate of the class, as reflected in the students' reports of increased satisfaction with school life and school work, improved order and discipline at school, and more positive social relationships. Now okay, so another example, and I'll be brief, and I have like 2 more minutes. Another example is a program in Canada called the Roots of Empathy. Has anyone ever heard about the Roots of Empathy? So the Roots of Empathy is another program that they've done a nationwide intervention to basically address this, what they're calling an empathy gap that's developing in the culture, which is this lack of connectedness. And they're going into schools and they're actually bringing this interesting intervention, but it's been wildly successful. They're bringing babies and parents into the classroom, into elementary schools, and getting them to spend the whole year there, once a week, I think, or once a couple weeks, and basically engaging with these babies and parents, and what it brings out is essentially the best in kids, right, in terms of their own sort of natural empathic abilities and social skills. And they found that this intervention, they've done the interventions for about the last 18 years, has significantly reduced bullying and aggression in school and enhances school engagement. Okay, and then in addition, we've done these things. I was fortunate to be part of a team that created a high school in the Lower East Side, and we implemented advisory groups to sort of think about how do you foster, build relationships. Now this is the key, not just among adults and kids, right? We always focus on the adult and kid relationship, which is important, but among kids, right? How do you build relationships among kids as well as among adult and kids? And then, obviously, among adults, right, in the school building. So it's building relationships across all different levels, not just the teacher-student relationship. Okay. The program and curriculum interventions in elementary, middle, and high schools indicate that what we already know but don't act on as much as we should, which is that fostering empathy and positive peer and adult relationships in school makes a significant difference in children's well-being. Susan Engel and Marlene Sandstrom argue that we need to revise how we think about the function of schooling so that we teach kindness along with algebra and history. Now the interesting thing about this body of work, which I want to link it back to Michael's Center, is that in none of this literature, this is the critique of this body of work that I'm showing here, do they talk about gender. They don't talk about gender in this discussion. They talk about fostering emotional skills, they talk about building relationships. They don't actually talk about the gender stereotypes that prevent that from happening, right? That get boys to shut down. And it's odd, It's odd. So in fact, what they're doing is they're doing what I would call gendered work in the sense that they're actually fostering these skills in boys and getting them to be more connected human beings. But the fact that they don't actually directly address it means that my guess is, right, once you started to try to do these interventions in adolescence in particular, the effect of them will just disappear. Because the boys would think they were lame, right, lame interventions, and basically not want to participate. So until, right, and part of the work that Michael and I are doing together is thinking about until we address these barriers to understanding the social-emotional development, we cannot enhance, right, we cannot foster resistance until you understand the barriers to that resistance. Okay, so in conclusion, what would it mean for us to let boys be boys by fostering their natural empathic abilities and their intimate friendships? What would it mean to define maturity as having emotionally supportive relationships? What would it mean to value the very skills that have been stereotypically associated with girls and women? Social and natural science has already given us the answers. If we were to value a full range of relationships, a biodiversity of sorts, and that being emotionally literate and invested in relationships is not a girl thing, or a gay thing, or even a childish thing, but an inherent part of being human, we would, according to the research, have better psychological and physical health, better academic outcomes, less bullying in and out of school, less violence, better marriages, better friendships, stronger communities, and longer lives. And that's all shown in the research. The boys in my studies seem to know this, but we as adults seem to have forgotten. If we listen closely, however, to both boys and girls during adolescence, we will begin to remember what we knew all along. What makes us human is our ability to deeply connect with others. And we must figure out ways to strengthen these critical life skills in and out of school. Then perhaps growing up might become, in fact, good for our health. Thank you. I want to show a two-minute video.
Romance is a tongue-in-cheek term to describe a close friendship between two guys. And according to the book Deep Secrets, boys...
Right. It's not playing on that.
Yeah, we need to exit the...
Oh, okay.
This was 4 boys that were interviewed as part of something else, an interview I was doing. These were 4 random boys that they interviewed.
They weren't part of your study. They just...
They weren't part of my study.
Romance is a tongue-in-cheek term to describe a close friendship between two guys. And according to the book Deep Secrets, boys long for and lose this intimacy as they get older. We asked 3 teenagers who had read the book to talk about their friendships and how they've changed through the years.
I mean, I guess it's different for every set of friends, you know. Men aren't really supposed to show emotion as much.
Always stay with your friends, you know. The guy could never leave a guy behind for a girl.
You can't be too flamboyant.
You can't really share things that are too personal.
Never telling each other.
Being too effeminate, relating too much to women is kind of a no-no. Yeah, that's not my personal views, but that's part of the guy code.
I've had the same 2-3 best friends my whole life, and I wouldn't say that we lost friendship. We just don't talk about certain things that we used to talk about.
There was a slump in high school where I kind of distanced myself from my friends. Not purposefully, but I just guess something would happen.
They don't say they miss me, they just say, where have you been? You haven't been here so long. I haven't seen you.
My younger self was a more open person, and I was more able to express feelings and emotions, whereas now it's sort of like there's some sort of rule that's not what grown men should do.
Guys stay away from expressing themselves because it puts them in the category of gay or girly when it's not really, and we just stay away from that.
We're kind of asked to be the individual, the stoic individual, who can sustain themselves and doesn't need really other people to rely on for emotional support or any kind of support, really.
Niobe Way is the author of Deep Secrets.
That's the part I didn't want. Quickly turn up. Okay, so now I just wanted to show you that so that you could actually hear some boys other than just hearing me quoting them. And also that my younger self used to be a more emotional self. I mean, you know, the eloquence of boys. I mean, this is a random kid when he says my younger self was a more emotional self, a more open self.
It looked to me as he was speaking that he was sort of catching himself actually feeling something about what the fact that he was describing the loss of feeling.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
I mean,
really interesting.
Yeah, and obviously the irony is that, of course, he's being deeply emotional in this interview, right? By talking about his younger self as a more emotional self. But just the language, the language that you just get across the board of these boys deeply attuned to what's going on.
But the setup with the football players and the basketball and the car, and then at the running head where they identified with the basketball on it.
Yeah, yeah. No,
it's like they're undermining their own your argument by the framing.
Yeah, they weren't not necessarily deep thinkers. Okay, so what are questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm wondering, I don't know if you're working with new groups of boys doing sort of
we're always doing that.
So I'm wondering if you're seeing this pattern of loss starting earlier. So I'm just thinking about girls. We're seeing like sexualization happening much earlier. Girls trying to be mature, very young. If like the same kind of thing is happening younger and younger for boys.
Well, that's an interesting. We just were talking about that on our research team. It's an interesting thing. I don't know yet because I haven't investigated it systematically yet. But definitely, I have a son who's 13. And watching his friends and looking at the middle school, I would also work in the middle school, an all-boys middle school. And it definitely seems like that is likely to be happening, which is that the whole expectations of manhood is earlier, so that the loss that I saw, you know, the last time, this book, the data stops at about 2004. If I did the next 20 years, my guess is the loss would be more around 13, 14. And that you would get the deep intimacy more at 11, 12. And so that it would be back, definitely the expectations of, it's a great question, because it's not looked at really, that the expectations of manhood are becoming even earlier as we sexualize girls, and we get them to be little adults sooner, little sexualized adults sooner for girls. Yeah, so yeah.
How much of your population was college bound? Like, was there an expectation that as high school neared an end, you were going to be forcibly separated from your friends, so you might as well emotionally disconnect? And then at the beginning of college, you sort of see a regrouping through Greek life of these sort of homosocial relationships that also weaken as the 4 years come to a close.
Homophobic oftentimes too. But yeah, so what you see is in some sense in Michael's work is that we see this kind of pattern across the board in terms of social class, college bound and non-college bound boys, and really what you see, the only difference that I would say, even though we haven't investigated empirically college students, but Michael has, is that boys, oftentimes, especially boys in fraternities, have a cover, what I would call a sheep in wolf's the wolf in sheep's clothing, which they have the cover story of.
Actually, it's sheep in wolf's clothing. They
think
of themselves as wolves, but they're really sheep inside. It's actually right. You were right the first time.
Yeah, exactly. Which is that the language is one of social, bromance. Man, I love you, man, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, it's not these vulnerable relationships that these 13-year-old boys are talking about. So that even in college, even among college boys, and I get NYU students telling me the same thing, male students, that what looks intimate to you guys is not intimate. We're not having the friendships we want to have, which is the intimacy, the vulnerability, the ability to really share painful experiences. What they have is what I would call bromance, which is this very, very superficial, you party together, you pick up women together, you get drunk together. And so basically, and that certainly might create a certain kind of bond. I'm not dismissing it, but that's not what the 13-year-old boys are talking about. They're talking about sharing deep secrets and protecting each other from, not making fun of you when you're feeling vulnerable and all those kinds of things. And college students are not experiencing that, and that's shown out in Michael's work too.
Well, and then just as a follow-up really quickly, you had mentioned 2000 as a really important time period where suicide rates among men started to increase and social media changed everything. I just want to comment that that's also around when Entourage started and lasted for 8 seasons, which I watched every episode of to understand how in the world this show was speaking to men. And my partner explained to me that he watched it when he missed his friends. and that it was sort
Oh, I'm
of
so gonna have to go
male
watch it.
friendship, escapist fantasy for men who were disconnected from friendships that they held
Oh, you're kidding.
sentiments about
I've
from
never
their
heard this. I've never
past.
heard this thing.
Yeah, and they
I'll look it up.
have. I'm so embarrassed to be talking about Entourage right now. But the main characters are lifelong best friends. They talk about it in like every episode. I've been friends with him since I'm 5, or something grammatically incorrect like that. And they have this like very loyal, unbreakable connection. And then there are a couple of other sort of associated friends that aren't quite as close, but you see emphasized in this television show that was on the air for 8 years and incredibly popular among male viewers, that this was something that they were relating to. And, you know, yeah, there was a lot of don't be a girl, yada yada thrown around, but they were emotionally vulnerable to each other. And it wasn't something that was tongue-in-cheek.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's
Maybe
fascinating.
men would have viewing parties to watch it the way women would watch Sex and the City together.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because usually when people give me examples of where you've seen it in the culture, it's the old bromance, stupid stuff.
Apatow movies.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's like the I Love You Man. Did anyone see I Love You Man?
Sure.
I mean that's the epitome.
Right.
You know, it's called I Love You Man. You think, oh, it must be, and it's completely just getting wasted and acting stupid and knocked up, and exactly. So yeah.
At some point you mentioned that the way teenagers start thinking about their friendships and not being so intimate anymore is their homophobic reaction. And I just realized that in United States, the same as in Western Europe, people speak openly about being homosexual. And still, the teenagers have this homophobic reaction. I come from Eastern Europe, and in Eastern Europe, people don't speak so freely about being homosexual. And on the other hand, male friendship is believed to be stronger and longer lasting than the female friendship. So this is a friendship that is supposed to last lifelong. And male friends keep being intimate with each other even when they grow up. And I just realized that maybe we are even more homophobic. We don't speak openly in media about homosexuality. So teenagers just don't get the idea that they might be suspected being homophobic because they have no friends.
Well, no, that's actually connected. So that I get that question a lot, and I think it's an important question, which is that basically what you get in this culture, which I just find fascinating and depressing, is that you get, I mean, people say, well, how can you get this theme in New York City? And I said, that's precisely the reason we get it in New York City. That in a context, and kids will tell you this, where basically everybody's gay or bisexual, meaning from a kid's perspective, you know, they're surrounded by gay and bisexual people, that essentially they want to assert, as a straight boy, they feel even more pressure to assert their heterosexuality. So that whole sense of, if everybody's gay here, I gotta make sure you as a girl and you as my other buddies, straight buddies, know that I'm straight. So the obsession with proving their heterosexuality, I would say, has probably increased as we've gotten more enlightened and progressive in terms of our understanding of sexuality. And that's because, right, Michael's book too, the Anger book, that's because the larger context is not actually nurturing to boys, right? Boys' social and emotional well-being. So that we, you know, if we raise boys to go against their nature, which is what we're doing, we're raising boys to go against their nature, they're going to grow up and be crazy. Right? I mean, that's what's going to happen. Not all boys, Michael. But the point is that the notion that we raise boys, and that's the point I want you to hear. The boys are showing me that their nature, their human nature is something very different than how we frame their nature. So if we raise them to go against their nature, right, to believe that you should be isolated to be mature, right, you should be isolated to be a real man. Why are we surprised that they grow up and they act crazy? And part of acting crazy is that sort of not understanding that, right, just believing that my main goal is to prove my heterosexuality rather than having close, intimate friendships with the people I want to have friendships. That's crazy thinking, right? That's crazy to privilege my heterosexuality identification in a homophobic context over my best loved friend, male friend, with another guy. But that's what we create as a culture, because we raise boys to literally go against what they naturally want to do.
But what I see as a paradox is that in a tolerant society,
Right.
when you can openly express your homosexuality or bisexuality,
It is a paradox.
those teenagers,
Yeah.
they just like feel they have to prove their sexuality.
Yeah, no, but that's the paradox. That's why it's hard. I mean, you know, it's hard. I've even had, there's somebody in England, you probably know, who wrote a book about how homophobia is declining.
Eric Answer.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we know him well.
Yeah. So he's written me many times saying I got it totally wrong. And you know, that homophobia is declining, and that basically there's all this proof. And all I say back to him is go look at some YouTube videos in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, but he has rugby players who kiss, right? So he's right.
Yeah. But the point is that that's why it's confusing. That's why on the left, oftentimes it gives a confused message. Because at some level we have a black president, no, at some level we have a black president, but violence against black people, right, and is increasing. We have, you know, women leaders, gay leaders, and at the same time you had the guy who got killed in Greenwich Village, what, a gay guy 2 months ago, 1 month ago? I mean, in Greenwich Village, he got murdered in Greenwich Village. A gay guy? Are you kidding me? What year are we? You know, like where are we?
Right.
For being gay, right?
Right, not just
I mean, like, what year are you? So the whole fact is that even though we're obviously having social progress, obviously, what's happening is it's a classic backlash argument, right? It's a classic backlash. The more progressive we get, the more, right? And this is Michael's book. The more progressive we get, the more threatened, right? Those in the status quo become, and then they start acting out and killing, right? And killing, because ultimately they're. And again, but I would say, taking their standpoint, right, what do you, for all you women in the room, right, imagine being raised, listen to Andy's quote, it would be nice to be a girl because then you wouldn't have to be emotionless. Imagine being raised, right, in a context where you couldn't express your feelings, because if you express your feelings, you're going to be pathologized. Imagine that. I mean, you would go wacko. Right, having to hold things in because somehow the expression of it would make you be seen as something's wrong with you. You're not normal. You're not typical. You're weird. You know, whatever word you use for that word. So I mean, I just think why you know, we shouldn't be surprised by Newtown, right? Mm-hmm. Newtown by Adam Lanza who killed all those kids. We shouldn't be surprised by these mass murders. I mean, it just completely makes sense to me in a culture that raises us to believe in incoherent things, first of all, and raises us to go against our nature, and particularly boys and men. And then, you know, believe in things like that feelings of girl or female and thinking is male. What? What kind of culture is this? Right? I mean, what kind of culture that actually sexualizes and genders basic human functions of thinking and feeling? You know, what kind of culture is this? And so then we get these mass murders every 2 weeks, and we think, why are we having this? Are you kidding me? You know, why are we getting more of it? You know, why are we seeing even more examples of it in public settings? And then so at some level, it's really looking at the contradictions and the paradoxes that are happening as the focus. And so then when we're so self-righteously liberal as Americans, we say, no, there's something else going on too. And the intimacy that you get in also Middle Eastern countries and in Eastern Europe, et cetera, among men, that's a complicated thing, because at some level, I think it's a very powerful thing, and at some level it's premised actually on misogyny, which is you're not allowed to have that with women,
yes.
right?
Yes,
because women
a
are...
woman is expected, because they believe that a male friendship lasts lifelong,
right.
And woman keeps close to her friends until she gets married.
Right, and then she has to sacrifice.
She's supposed to focus on her family.
Yeah.
It's the opposite.
Hmm?
It's the opposite, actually.
What do you mean?
Women tend to take friendships with them throughout their lives, and men's friendships tend to be far more episodic.
Yeah.
So when they leave the workplace, one workplace and go to another one, they leave their friends behind.
Right.
So that by their mid to late 40s, many heterosexual men's friends are the husbands of their wives' friends.
On the contrary, in Eastern Europe.
Yeah, no, I know that. I mean, he's talking American, you're talking Eastern Europe, yeah.
I have a comment to make.
To
make.
Yeah.
I have a comment about this, and I have a hypothesis mostly for Joseph, and then I have a question for you. The answer, the comment is you know, I spend a lot. I mean, you really rescue a phrase for me that I've always regarded as the most depressing phrase in educational policy circles, which is boys will be boys.
Yeah, right.
Because I always interpret that as, you know, we throw up our hands in resignation, we can't do anything about it.
Right.
They are, you know, out of control, rambunctious animals, and They're, you know, and that's always the anti-feminist position, the Christina Hoff Sommers position, for example, is boys will be boys. It biologizes it, etc. Well, you say if we let boys be boys, they would be this instead.
Exactly.
And we actually ask them to be other than boys. So if you read your book and then Guyland, you see the moment, as you move from one book to the other, what happens to them when they lose this connection, this ability to have their friends.
Right.
So that's my observation, is you rescue that phrase from me. You're the only person for whom that becomes positive.
Yeah, yeah.
The hypothesis is, one of the quotes, one of the boys says that that the friendship in his life helps him feel more connected to school. Did you hear that, Joseph? Also, he says he helps him feel more connected to school.
Yeah.
Well, one of the big issues that all of these boys in education things is facing, the gender gap in grades, the attendance stuff, is that boys are disengaging.
Yeah.
So in some ways you're suggesting, for in policy terms, that good close friendships might be something that would help boys remain engaged, because disengagement, educational disengagement, is a way to prove your masculinity. Like how little a shit you give about school is a marker of manhood.
No, I mean, but that's what I mean by incoherent beliefs.
School is feminine.
Well, right.
No, that's right. But that's what I mean by incoherent beliefs. We believe doing well in school now is a female thing.
It's for girls.
You know, it's for girls. And I mean, even my son, who reads a lot, you know, he came home and he said, why is reading considered a girl thing? I mean, you know, where did we come up with the idea that reading, and this is totally American, you know, reading is a girl thing, and that somehow, you know, when did reading get feminized?
Right.
And not that it's bad to be a girl thing, but you know, why would it? I mean, when did that happen? I mean, it's these set of beliefs that based on, if I'm going to get into, since I'm talking about Men and Masculinity Center, and instead of jargon, but I think it's meaningful jargon, is a set of binaries that are incoherent, right? A set of binaries, right, that make no sense, and yet we continue to perpetuate them, right? The difference between man, woman, black, white, rich, poor, we could go on and on and on. And here in this case, we're talking about man, woman, that make no sense. Make no sense, yeah.
Wait, let me,
sorry, Michael.
Here's my question.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was one of my observations. Here's my question. One of the biggest changes in young people's lives, now this is college age that I'm talking about, and something that I've spoken with you about, because I think it's a joint research project that you and I should be doing together.
Yes.
One of the biggest changes in college students' lives is cross-sex friendships.
Yeah.
25 years ago, when I started teaching, I would ask my students if anybody in the room had a good friend of the opposite sex, and I might get 10% hands. Now I almost never get a hand if I ask the question, does anyone here not have a good cross-sex friend? So the question then is, given the gendering of close friendships, given what you've described, is cross-sex friendships then a kind of compensation for the lost friendships of boyhood that we're seeking to do even before we do it with our spouses, which is what most straight guys will do? Are we seeking to do that with our women friends?
Yeah, I mean, I would say if you talk to men, and this is Michael coming from being on various radio shows and getting men callers in, because that's oftentimes a conversation. They'll talk about their relationship with their wives. Right. The answer is definitely yes. That they see it as a way to gain some kind of intimacy with another person and to sort of work out their emotional lives. However, men have said directly to me, which I think is so right on, they said, you know, imagine if the only person you had to talk to about your husband was your husband. Right? That's all they said. Imagine the only person you had to talk about your spouse, your male spouse, was him. And so they're saying essentially, no, you know, that's not enough. It's not enough. I want to be able to talk about that's what I said about biodiversity, right? I want to be able to talk to different people about my relationships, my friendships, my romantic partnerships. So the whole question is, yes, I do think men turn to women. Now the sad part is when there's lots of studies, by the way, that show men will report their best friends to be women, but women will report other women. Yeah. Right? So it's not equal in terms of like how they see the relationship. Yeah.
I was just from a Jewish studies graduate background, just going to say that in terms of associating bookishness with femininity, I mean, that goes back to Jacob, that is very, very entrenched in Judeo culture, and I'm going to get rid of the hyphen, the Jewish culture and Christian culture, and in, response, secular culture, this Jacob-Esau division that the Jewish culture really embraced as, an alternative masculinity that was valued within Jewish community of being bookish, but was sort of in opposition to the forces of secularizing culture and Christian influenced culture that would have it be more of an Aesop type of archetype.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that is interesting is why is it particularly American? So in Germany, for example, you don't get that same equation that reading is a feminine thing. It's a very distinctly American. I mean, you're starting to get in more and more countries, but it's the idea, the anti-intellectualism in this country is gendered.
Right.
So that and right behind
So speaking back to potential variability, do you have any out non-heterosexual boys, either to you or to their friends?
Yeah.
And does that change things for the friendships?
I mean, the truth of the matter is that in a study on boys' friendships where the whole culture sexualizes them, we did not ask about sexuality because we were afraid, for good reason. If we asked about sexuality, or even if we asked, the minute they would sniff that this was about assessing their sexuality, we had never gotten these stories.
Yeah.
So we stayed away from it. We had 4 kids in our sample, in the most recent longitudinal sample of 130, who said, I'm gay, right, and who came out on it. Their narratives, honestly, it was 4 kids, so it was 4 kids, but their narratives sounded just very similar. And in fact, I've had gay kids tell me, which is something that is worthy of a whole investigation of another study, that they actually feel that they have more pressure to be hypermasculine than straight kids because they're trying to even really cover over. They don't want to be a gay stereotype.
Yeah.
And so that I've had gay kids say, oh no, those themes are true for us, even worse so. We're going to sound even more hypermasculine. And that relates to diversity, by the way, that the boys, and this is the interesting thing, this will be interesting for you too, Michael, the boys who were the most comfortable with their masculinity were the boys who were the most resistant, right? So if you're comfortable in your masculinity, you are the most resistant. So Justin, beautiful Justin, who I quote from the beginning to the end, when he's talking about his love, his human nature love, I just love this. First of all, you have to imagine him. He's Puerto Rican, good-looking kid. Good looks is another thing that we never talk about in this culture, but that gives him a lot of power, masculinity power, right? He's good-looking to girls. And he's holding a basketball the entire interview for 2 hours. He's holding a basketball. And it's stunning. It's stunning. It's literally like saying, that was his no homo, right? But he's holding onto his basketball the entire time, talking. I love my friend, he's holding his basketball. And then, of course, as you can imagine, he's also a basketball player at school. He's a good basketball player. So he was extremely comfortable in his masculinity. He was a basketball player. He was Puerto Rican, which is a whole other New York finding, which I think some of you may, is Puerto Rican kids, because they, according to other kids, have the right skin tone, right? They're brown, they're not white, they're not black. They have the right hair tone, hair texture. The language is the right language, meaning it's not Chinese, right? It's Spanish, which is cool. And they're Americans. They're not immigrants, right? Made them very, very cool. So a lot of our very resistant boys were Puerto Rican boys. And our least resistant boys, who do you imagine are the least resistant boys? Who do you imagine are the most challenged in their masculinity? I'm not talking about gay kids. Who do you think are the most challenged? Asian and white boys. Asian and white boys. And white boys in particular, right? Asian and white boys who didn't play sports. Right? They were the most threatened in their sexuality, in their masculinity, and therefore you sometimes got a trace of resistance in there, but oftentimes it was like, it was really hard work to get them to say anything, because they were the ones oftentimes, I don't care, whatever, doesn't matter, I'm not interested in that, I'm focused on my studies, I don't care, yes, no, I don't have any friends, I don't care. Or they would be the sort of white kid that looked like he had a lot of friends, but in fact the vulnerability of those friendships it was clear that he was not feeling connected to those friendships, even though he looked like he was sort of like emo kids, I think. The old emo kids, right? The white boys that are sort of testing issues of masculinity, but when you actually looked at, in the studies I've seen, or the anecdotes I've heard, that again, the vulnerability, it's not about just boys having friends. It's about the specific kind of vulnerable ways to really share in a very deeply connected way that boys then fear as they get older, because they wonder what it means. And quite frankly, as all women know, right, there actually is, and that's a question you could all throw at my, you know, there actually is sexuality to friendships, right, to all friendships.
Mm-hmm.
The intimacy actually does lean over into a sexual, you know, feelings, sexual feelings. Now, whether you want to, right, have sex with that person or another is another issue. But the whole point is that intimacy, emotional intimacy actually does feel sexual at times, right, when you're very, very close to someone. And, right, so if you think as women, we can sort of oftentimes tolerate that because we're not pathologized in the same way for that intimacy. But boys, right, that sense of, oh my God, you know, I'm feeling aroused by this conversation, you know, oh my God, right? So that whole sense of the blending of the very real fact that human relationships, right, intimacy is sexual. And, you know, we can debate the extent to which it is, but, you know, as someone deeply engaged in various types of relationships, I feel it. I feel it. Yeah.
Would it be your guess that these kinds of dynamics, this emotional openness in early teen years, would be equally true in Wyoming or Texas or St. Louis, Missouri?
Yeah.
Feels to me like an Eastern Seaboard kind of phenomenon.
Well, no. You know what? You know where the evidence goes against what you're saying is that the farm boys in the state of Illinois in 1904. I mean, that basically there have been enough studies of different boys from different places to suggest that you get these kinds of emotional, intimate stories. The other thing is, Michael, when you look at the boys' literature, not your stuff, but the sort of Bill Pollock stuff, but also even Gurian stuff.
Yeah.
There's oftentimes in Gurian's work, this is just a person who's written a lot about boys' development, he argues, Michael Gurian is the person who says that boys are by nature unempathic and don't want relationships. I mean, he's sort of my nemesis. But in his book, he actually talks about, this is the funny thing, I say this in the book, he actually talks about his own friendships and the importance of his own friendships as he was growing up as a boy, and the intimacy in those friendships. And so you see it, and also in the sort of the movie, what I say, Stand By Me, you see it in those boys. I mean, there's a way in which you see it enough in popular culture and in all sorts of types of boys that I don't think it's an East Coast thing. Now, perhaps parts of the language of the way it's expressed could be varied by parts of the country, but the whole idea, and then I give talks across the country. You know, I go to the Midwest, I go to various places, I get people coming, I get email from across the world, I mean from boys and men saying, this is my experience, this is what I experienced, you're telling my story. I had an elderly man from Appalachia come once and he drove 3 hours to hear me give my talk, or 4 hours or some crazy amount, and then he brought his library book of Deep Secrets because he couldn't afford to buy the book, so I gave him a book obviously. But he said, he was probably, I think he was probably 78 or 79, he told me his age. And he said, where were you in my generation? And I said, well, what do you mean? And he said, we needed someone like you in my generation because we're so messed up. Right? Like that whole idea, right? That whole idea of a whole, for him it was a whole generation of not feeling like he could have the relationships that he wanted to have. And he thought, you know, I was amazed.
The one thing I would say to Bob's comment though, that does, you know, there are regional gender cultures.
Yeah, for sure.
There's some really good psychological, social psychology experiments that found codes of honor, for example, and being dissed and being disrespected are far more pervasive among white boys in the South than they are in any other part in the country. And you know those experiments because it was guys at Michigan who did it. But they have this. The experiment is you walk down the hall to the experimental room and somebody bumps into you, and they do this in different areas. And when you bump into the person who you bumped into you says asshole, and then you continue on. And then what they measure when you get to the experiment room, then they measure things like your level of aggression and I mean, you know this experiment. I don't remember the authors, but I cited in Dialogue because it's really, actually I think I cited it here. It's a fascinating study that showed in the South these guys walk into the experiment room and they are off the charts aggressive. But in no other place, not in the East, not in the Midwest, and not in the West. But in the South, those codes of honor are so powerful that that alone, that little moment of being bumped in the hallway, will make you more aggressive. So I do think there may be something to regional codes of masculinity, but I also think that there are some things that probably are pervasive. And these norms, these media norms, for example, that Helena's talking about, these media ideas of masculinity, they are pervasive and national.
Right.
Yeah, sorry.
I was particularly, what you said about male suicide, which I think is in some ways something that statistic that it always surprises people, because I think people always assume that that's a woman thing.
Exactly.
And the fact this lack of emotion. My 14-year-old nephew had 2 acquaintances hang themselves within a period of 3 months. And just in some ways that you sort of, again, we sort of don't even think about that happening, and then all of a sudden having these conversations about what leads to that.
Well, it's also interesting. I had two difficult experiences. One is my uncle committed suicide when he was 16, and the family story about my uncle's suicide was that he killed himself because a girl broke up with him, so that. When I'm now talking, I get a lot of emails from mothers, unfortunately, that it's very hard, who tell me their son has committed suicide and they want to reach out to find out why. And so she also said, this one woman reached out to me and she said, my son committed suicide, can I send you copies of his journal? And I, basically, she had sort of been in, this was many, many years after the suicide, so I wasn't playing the role of a mental health worker. So I said, okay, and so we talked. And she also had the story that she committed suicide because of a girl. And I read his journal, and it's so about friendships. It's so about the disappointment of not having, he was 16, the disappointment of not connecting with people, not feeling like his guy friends understood him, not feeling, feeling alone. He struggling with his girlfriend too. But there was the theme of his journal in the last, she sent me, I think it was the last 6 weeks of his life. It's very, very focused on friendship. So I also think there's a narrative in suicide that if a boy kills himself, it must be over a girl. And I'm not saying it might be also because of a girl. I'm not saying that it's not. I'm just saying there's a whole other, right? The way we even frame suicide is framed by.
But if you had a friend to talk to about the girl, then
right, exactly.
Mass violence is also generally a suicide.
Right, of course.
It's a very violent suicide. You get lots of attention, but they almost always are suicides.
That's right. No, exactly. And so I think the suicide, and if we framed it as suicides, then we would be more alarmed by the suicides. But we don't frame it as suicide. We frame it as an issue of gun control, or we frame it as an individual weird kid, schizophrenic kid, rather than a larger. Right? It's indicative of a larger pattern of boys and men killing themselves. Yeah.
So I just want to say I'm a developmental psychologist who studies gender, so you're not alone. In fact, there's a little group of us now that meet, but anyway. And I was so struck by what you said about how developmental psychologists just don't, for years, didn't seem to recognize that boys had feelings and friends and all of that. And when my boys were growing up and they're now in their 30s, they, in fact, I could tell that they had really good friends because they'd be on the phone for hours, and I thought, oh my God, it's like when I was a teenage girl, that, and I would eavesdrop enough to know that they were, revealing secrets and things like that.
No, I just have to say, sorry, I want to hear your question, but I just have to say, that kind of, what she just said, you see that in the boys' literature, but they don't do anything with it. They'll say these boys are talking on the phone all the time, but they don't do anything with it. They don't pay attention to the data that says exactly opposite of what they're actually arguing. So
I know, and I was a developmental psychologist, so I was reading all the stuff about boys are like this, and I'm thinking, is it just because I'm all involved in gender and women's studies that my boys are different, and yay, feminist boys, and but they're acting like girls, and then, but I think now I realize no, they were just normal boys, right? But I think the difference is maybe that now that they are older, they in fact did manage to maintain those intense friendships. They still have their best friend from high school is still one of their very best friends. So maybe there was some influence. But I also, that's sort of an aside. The other thing is, on the sort of hopeful side,
Yeah.
whatever, when I was still working, I worked a lot with a group that tried to do acquaintance rate prevention on campus, and we would work with these male and female kids, and they would do a play, and then they would answer questions from the audience, say that, and in character, there would be the rapist, his best friend, the victim, and her best friend, and so all of the students we spent a lot of time working with them, talking with them in groups, and people would share stories, and they would tell what people had come up to them and said to them after the presentation, and lots of times people would come up and say, "I've never told anyone this," and dump this on these poor kids. Yeah. And so they had to meet with us frequently and so on. And the thing that struck me was that by the time they had been in this program doing this for 2 years, these guys, a lot of whom were people like football players who'd been injured so they couldn't be on the team anymore, and so on, so they had to spare time to do this. The guys, by the time the graduation came and they were no longer going to be in this program, where they had formed these really intense friendships with them, were literally sobbing. I mean, these great big guys, and they were
so many times,
saying goodbye to these friends. So I think even in college age, it's possible for guys to form these friendships.
So going back,
where they reveal with, so to speak, therapeutic roots.
I mean that's why I gave the word of warning at the beginning of the talk that I'm going to homogenize for the sake of revealing a pattern in the data. The reality is that my story from the boys is a very deeply, deeply optimistic story. Because once you see that boys have it in them, that is all optimism. Because then all it takes is actually fostering it. It's fostering it. Yeah. And so we find quantitatively, I have a fantastic former doctoral student, Carlos Santos, who Michael knows about, who found empirically in a study of 500 boys that those longitudinal, those who had close relationships with their mothers were more likely to be resistant and to hold on to their friendships. And I'm not saying that it has to be mothers for all you fathers in the room, but oftentimes mothers are the person in this culture who foster that emotional connection. So the closer they were to their mothers, the longer they were able to hold on to their friendship. So I wasn't kidding when I said it's...
Or the longer they maintain the connection to mother. Because we ask boys to separate from mother way too early to sever that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, the whole notion that we ask them to separate from the very, from the very person who they oftentimes rely on emotionally, and we do that with friendships and we do that with mothers. We ask them to separate from the very relationship that keeps them healthy. And then the other thing I just want to throw your way, because you'd like this, is that there's a book called The Mama's Boy Myth, by a journalist, I'm blanking on the name. And she said, I spoke to her on the phone when I was writing this book, and she said she knew she had her book when she had her 400th mother that she interviewed mothers across the country, who said, "Well, boys aren't emotional, but my boy is." When the 400th mother said, "My boy's the exception," she said, "That's my boy." Right? Is that the exception is that we believe in things, right? That even though we know it's not true for ourselves, we still believe in it. My daughter, my brilliant 9-year-old daughter said to me, "Mommy," when I was talking about gender stereotypes to her, she said, "Mommy, why do we believe in things that we know are not true?" And I thought, oh my God, that's the question. Why do we believe in things that we know from our own experience are not true? But we still think boys are not emotional, it must just be my boy. And so I just think, to pick up on your point, absolutely, there are boys who maintain the resistance in my sample, in the boys we talk to. There are grown men who tell me, talk about having lots of, or at least one or two, very, very deep, intimate friendships, and then you start poking around and you realize that their resistance was fostered, and their emotional well-being was fostered by typically moms, but sometimes it could be dads, sometimes it could be aunts, sometimes it could be grandfathers. I mean, and grandfathers are interesting, by the way, because men, I have discovered in doing this book, there are two age periods that sound very similar. What do you imagine I'm going to say?
Boyhood and grandfatherhood.
Boyhood and grandfathers. Those two groups of men sound remarkably similar. Because it's the grandfathers, right? It's the 78-year-old guy from Appalachia. The grandfathers and the 13 and 14-year-old boys are very connected to their own vulnerability and their own desire for relationships. I've had men come up to me again, I'm guessing their age, but late 70s, early 80s, who come up to me and crying, you know, having all these very emotional experiences. But I had an elderly gentleman tell me, I've been looking for the kind of friendship I've had in early adolescence my whole life. I've never had it with my wife. And he said, I'm now beginning to have it with my daughter, which I thought was interesting. He said, so I'm beginning to have that relationship with my daughter, which I'm really enjoying. But he was incredibly emotional. I thought, what we really need to do as an intervention is get grandfathers talking to boys. Right? Grandfathers talking to, not little boys, right? 11, 12, 13-year-old boys, so that they each are fostering the resistance for each other, and then also getting them to obviously talk to older boys too. But and it's good for the grandfather, right, as well as for the kids. So that whole sense of, as we get older, men, right, and you're able to, right, and you talk to me about that, the sort of physical vulnerability that you start to feel.
The thing that the data on the grandfathers is that. You know, what I hear from their sons, who are the new fathers, who are saying to their own fathers, how come you are willing to like roll around on the floor with your grandson, but you never were there for me.
You didn't do that for me.
And their fathers say, well, when I had you, I had to like support the family and make a lot of money and you know, and be a provider, so I had to be at work all the time. But now you have my children have children. You know, I don't have to prove anything anymore.
Right.
So what's similar in a funny way between the boys, pre-adolescent boys, and the grandfathers is they don't have that much to prove. Because it's the proving that shuts you down.
Now they can change a diaper.
So it's the proving question, and so you know the big question anyone would have. I mean, you answer it, but the big question anyone would have when they read your book or listen to you is, why does this happen?
Right.
What are the causes of this colossal disconnect? Right. So that from 17 until your guys at 79, they're looking back at their boyhoods nostalgically, longing for those friendships that they once had. Right. And so I mean, and one of the things is, well, you got to prove it now.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. I mean, and the whole thing is that how you know, if you talk to, I mean, the whole pressure, because being a man, fitting into the stereotypic notions of manhood, is not just about being a man, it's also about being normal. I mean, the whole ways it's linked with, right? It's linked with the narrative about who's normal and who's not normal.
And
so
who's
the whole
an individual and autonomous.
Exactly. So who would actively choose to not be normal, right? I mean, actually, most
a lot of people here are ready to raise their hands now.
Not a random sample.
We should take one more question and then close the formal part of this.
Really, a follow-up on that. It's proving it shuts you down. There's got to be some adaptive reason why manhood is kicking in earlier and earlier. You've said there's partly the sexualization of kids into adults really early and partly backlash.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's something else that shuts down friendships, that it's more dangerous as they get older to confide vulnerable secrets. There's more shaming, and maybe it's simply girly, homo, this and that, but I'm wondering if there's some other kind of danger that's afoot. And the only other thing I can come up with is simply a capitalist workplace, but that finally is much more collaborative than the academic workplace, and that doesn't entirely make sense. So what's ultimately...
Well, I mean, I do think, you know, the odd thing is that we are becoming, you know, so I have a whole other riff which we don't have time for, is how the girls' work in the 90s, you know, that was talking about the importance of relationships for girls and helping girls build healthy relationships, turned into the kick-ass girl, turned into the mean girl, right? So that the whole thing is that we all now as women want to be kick-ass women, and kick-ass women are basically women who don't need relationships, right? Who aren't vulnerable, right? Because vulnerability has increasingly become lame, right? That to be vulnerable is to be weak. And so as women and men increasingly want to be masculine, stereotypically, right? And so that that it creates this deep hatred in the culture towards vulnerability.
So why is that happening?
Because I think in some sense, because nobody's talking about the elephant in the room, I think because at some level because nobody's having the conversation of the thicker, nobody in the mainstream culture is having a conversation about the thicker story about why is it that we're idealizing the very thing that actually hurts us.
Yeah.
You know, and if nobody's had that conversation, we spin like this, we spin out of control so that we're now idealizing the kick-ass woman. I even had this comment for all you feminists in the room, which I assume is everybody. I heard the woman, did you read the book The End of Men? Did anybody read The End of Men? The Hannah Rosen book? Okay.
We just read it in our seminar, actually.
So she has a statement in there, and I'm not going to quote her exactly, I don't quite remember. But she says something to the effect of, women in their 30s are now empowered because they no longer need relationships and they can have hookup sex and focus on their career.
This?
And if we are now in a period, this links to your question, if we are now in a period where empowerment is about not being human, right? That empowerment is about not being human, right? To not need relationships. Are you, I'm being videotaped, so I can't say it, but are you crazy? Are you crazy? You're saying empowerment is not needing relationships? That, you know, we need relationships. We thrive on relationships. That is all our essence.
Yeah.
And to say that empowerment for women is about not needing relationships, that just shows the extremes in which, right, that we are in a place of hating any kind of relational, vulnerable, female-sounding like, gay-sounding like qualities, right? I mean, that, and so that boys getting more hyper-masculine earlier, I think relates to that, that vulnerability is, for girls and for boys, is absolutely the worst you can be. That you have to, it's the whatever culture. What is whatever? Whatever that entered into our culture in the 1980s and the 80s, and it has now exploded, that constantly saying whatever. And if you think about when you say whatever, because I know all of you say it, it's oftentimes, not always, but it's oftentimes when you want to remove yourself, right? You want to be less vulnerable, so you end it with, oh, whatever. You know, I thought this, whatever. And so the whole thing of in a whatever culture, of course boys are going to be more hyper-masculine earlier on because caring, right? This is the message, vulnerability, caring is lame. Like to care, to really care, is considered weak. I mean, how did we end up this way? And I think it's because we've had such thin conversations about our struggles so that it becomes about the girls' work quickly turned into the girls' work must be anti-boy, right. And then the boys' work turned into anti-girl. You know, I mean, we just repeat the same because we're not having a thicker conversation of, okay, come on, the girls' work is not anti-boy, the boy work is not, I mean, some of the boy work is.
Yeah, some of the boy work is anti-girl.
Yeah, exactly, anti-girl. But the point is the good boy work is not anti-girl. That it's a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy. It's about helping us, men, women, girls, boys, thrive in the world. How do we help us? How do we get us out of the ditch? And so the whole question is, I think, that I don't know the answer to, is, I think it's the lack of the thicker story being discussed, but I bet you if we really sat down together, we could come up with other reasons of why we're sort of in such a hyper-masculine mode right now. We're hyper-masculine, even more so I would say than possibly the 50s.
Sure.
I mean, this hyper-masculine, you know, in the midst of, you know, having bromance, right?
I'm really aware of the time, so it's really just bring this to an end. But hyper-masculine, yes, and at the same time, women and men have never been more equal.
I know, that's what
Rosen is saying, right? It's
the
rise of, it's not the end of men, it's the masculinization of women.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly, thank you. I'm going to use that.
Anyway, we should bring this formal part of our conversation to a close, and thank Niobe so much.
Yeah,